Welcome, everybody.
Hi, Eric.
Thank you for coming out this evening. Even though I know everybody here, I'm still going to introduce myself. Win TV, courtesy of Mike Cook, is graciously recording this for playback later. So off we go. So welcome. My name is Eric Weiner, and I'm with the Clean Water Task Force at Windsor Climate Action. And I'm thrilled to be joined this evening by Ann Hulick, who runs the Connecticut branch of Clean Water Action and the Clean Water Fund. Ann has just an ideal background to discuss what we're going to be discussing tonight. And that she started her career as a nurse and an RN, as a very high-level nursing executive, and then moved on and had a bit of a career change and got her law degree and has been focusing on environmental law for the last
10 years.
while. So let's begin. Hey, Len.
Hi, Eric. Good evening.
Good evening. So I'd like to just review first the origins of sort of PFAS and Windsor. So let's look back a few years, back to 2019, and understand how we got where we are today, and give you some general background on some of the science behind what we're looking at. So start off, what are PFAS? PFAS refers to a class of chemicals, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Ready, class? All together now. There are about 15,000 distinct members of the class of PFAS chemicals. 15,000. The thing they have in common is they have a fully saturated carbon-fluorine bond. I won't go into all the chemistry here, but those are some of the toughest bonds that exist in the universe. It's very hard to pull a carbon and fluoride atom apart. And that's going to become important when we talk about PFAS being a forever chemical. So we can thank the 3M Corporation back in the 40s and 50s for inventing this. And DuPont then became the primary manufacturer, and they made something called Teflon. Turns out PFAS chemicals as a class have some very beneficial uses. They're anti-stick. Scotchgard contains PFAS to prevent stains. Repels grease. Pizza boxes, up until a couple of years ago in Connecticut, were lined with a PFAS coating. And they also, they're also very heat resistant because of that tight bond. They're also the primary component, up until a couple of years ago, of firefighting foam, because it can just smother the foam. So they're all over the place. Some examples, what we just talked about. They're in playground equipment. They're in cosmetics, the water repellent capabilities of some mascara and lipsticks. Lots of the dental floss, the Teflon-coated dental floss, is PFAS embedded, and an awful lot of clothing and carpets. And we can just keep going on and on. So we have these chemicals. The science over the years has taught us that they're dangerous. And we first started to learn that about 20 years ago when there was a farmer in West Virginia who noticed his cows were dying. And eventually he had a connection in his head to a DuPont factory in his town that was producing one of the types of PFAS molecules that's abbreviated PFOA. People were getting sick. Cancers were showing up. Birth defects were showing up. Vegetation wasn't growing right. So something was wrong. And eventually this farmer wound up contacting an attorney, a gentleman named Rob Bilott. And his story was told in the movie Dark Waters that came out a couple of years ago, played by Mark Ruffalo. And it was the farmer and Rob that caught on to the fact that there's something bigger here than just a couple of sick cows. And they dug and dug, and it's taken 20 years, but we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, finally some regulatory work at the national level has caught up with it. So since these chemicals are hard to destroy, they move around the environment. So they're going to be perhaps made in the factory. And then there's some waste from the factory that gets discharged. That waste might flow to the river, or there's solids from the factory or from somebody's home that gets thrown in a landfill. The water in the landfill leaches through, flows into a river, perhaps a little bit like our Farmington River in our landfill in town. Sometimes the waste is incinerated, so the chemicals are going up the smokestack. You have to get the temperature up to 1,700 degrees in order to break the bond. The typical trash incinerator doesn't come anywhere close to that temperature. So we keep cycling them all over the place. They've detected PFAS chemicals in snow at both poles, and it is in 97% of Americans' blood has detectable levels of these chemicals. A sad story was a farmer up in Maine who was a young couple. They started in their late 20s, maybe. They wanted to become farmers. And they bought some land, had some nice grazing pasture on it, had a herd of cows, and they tested their milk. And the milk was incredibly heavily contaminated, and so was the soil, and it just destroyed their business. That land is basically unusable unless it's removed, and you don't just remove acres and acres of topsoil. So what are some of the exposure routes? Well, you can drink water, you can eat other items. It's frequently found in many household cleaners may have some PFAS chemicals in them. Specialty products, specialty medical products. Gore-Tex jackets are covered with basically Scotchgard, which is PFOA, one of these PFAS molecules. Since these bonds are so hard to break, there's a term that's applied, they bioaccumulate. It's like the roaches in the commercials. They check in, but they don't check out. So they just settle in organisms' fatty tissues and accumulate over the ages. So you might only be consuming small little bits, but they're staying with you. And it's in the air. And that was a sad shock that we realized over the last few years, that it's just there. So besides water contamination, you don't want to drink the stuff, you don't want your vegetables or your cows grazing on grass that's been contaminated. And there's no effective way yet to destroy this stuff. So you can filter it. You can get filters for your home. Water treatment plants, in many cases now, are starting to filter for it. But what do you do with the clogged up filters? You send them to a landfill and you start all over again. So we built a bit of a monster that there is not yet a technical solution for. So why Windsor? Back on June 9th, 4 years ago in 2019, at one of the private airplane hangars up at Bradley, there was a discharge of 40,000 gallons of what's called aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, which is the firefighting foam that you've seen in pictures or seen used. And that's been very effectively used for firefighting, particularly for petroleum-based fires, for many years. It's written in law, for instance, that AFFF must be used up until last year on military bases. So you would find huge amounts of contaminated land on air bases and near firefighting training academies because the firefighters are practicing with this stuff and wading through it and getting cancer. And there are these cancer clusters among firefighters that is just tragic. So that spill happened back in June of 2019. The state got on it very fast. DEEP was out here, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, they were out here that same day starting remediation. They hired a commercial waste contaminant firm to put booms around it. They started vacuuming up this foam that was accumulating in the river. And they immediately put a no fishing ban up along the river. This spill came in, MDC has a discharge pipe that is up Pequannock Ave a ways. I'm forgetting the name of the street that it's opposite of.
Sorry? I think it might be opposite Eastview.
Yes, correct, yep. And there's a big outfall pipe from the MDC water treatment plant there. And even though the spill happened at the airport, foam was coming out of those pipes all the way downstream. Government sometimes works really well. And in my opinion, that applied to the state of Connecticut. The following month, the governor set up a task force, and he demanded that an action plan come up that be developed within 6 weeks of the formation of that task force on July 8th with a plan for Connecticut. There were a series of intense meetings. We had all the department heads, all the commissioners from across the state in one room. Ann and I were at that meeting. Private citizens like ourselves joined this task force, and an action plan was developed, money was put behind it, and on July 20th of 2021, a bill was signed by the governor that banned PFAS materials in packaging. So it won't be in your McDonald's wrappers or your pizza box. Got rid of this type of firefighting foam throughout the state. If you go up to one of our fire stations now, you'll see a next generation foam that's free of this and has been tested safe. So this was a case of a problem found, good minds got together, addressed in Connecticut, but only in Connecticut. We also had some bad luck. A few months after that first spill, there was another incident at Bradley. I don't know if you recall when a B-17 bomber was, an antique plane was coming in for a landing and crashed. And 7 of the passengers and crew lost their lives. And that was another case. In this picture in the bottom right is a brook from here in Windsor where the firefighting foam was heading back towards the Farmington. Okay, we're going to switch now. That's how we got to where we are. But to understand what has happened at the federal level, We need to do a little math and a little chemistry and understand what a PPT is. That is not PowerPoint. It's a part per trillion. These chemicals are poisonous at a minute concentration, and it's important to have some visual understanding of what that level of concentration is. So I've got 1 liter of MDC water here, courtesy of the town hall. I'm going to take 1 drop of McCormick green food coloring and drop it in here and shake it up. Can you all see the green color here? So this is about a quart. So what is a part per trillion? If you look at the bottom left, 1 part per trillion is the equivalent of a grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. A grain of sand. Or this, pour this into Barkhamsted Reservoir, and that would be about a part per trillion of this green food coloring. So just to detect the chemicals pushes the bleeding edge of science these days. There's some amazing work that's been done down at Yale and the Yale School for the Environment on detecting these chemicals. UConn is doing some amazing work. So at the time of the spill, Connecticut had a guideline of you don't want more than 70 parts per trillion of a collection of these PFAS chemicals in your drinking water at any one time. If you look at the chart on the right, those are some of the measurements that were detected in the Farmington in the day of the spill and a couple of weeks after. It's got up to about 1.5 million parts per trillion. The goal at that point was 70. That was a little bit high. That's the problem. It did flush out. There's one, you hear the folks at DEEP say it, the solution to pollution is dilution. So it did dilute out as far as the Farmington goes, but it still sticks around in the sediments, in the sea life, the grasses that live there. It starts to bioaccumulate. The birds eat the fish. It builds up in their tissues, and on and on. So just keep that in mind, though, the level of concentrations we're talking about. When you get your water quality report from the MDC, there's an insert that probably most people throw away. I'm a geek, I always read those. And it tells you about the contaminants in your water. Those are mostly measured in the parts per million, or occasionally parts per billion. We're talking things that are 1 million times more dangerous on a molecule per molecule basis than things like too much nitrates or copper or lead in your water. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann, and she's going to take you through some of the health effects, some great news that came out of the federal government last week, Connecticut status, and what we have to do going forward, because we all have some homework. Ann.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Thank you to my friend Eric for his leadership, and to everyone from Windsor Climate Action. You've all been real pioneers in really coming together and addressing this issue, and it's a pleasure to speak with you tonight. So, as Eric said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the health impacts of these chemicals, even again at that part per trillion level, which is really hard to understand. What the EPA, our federal government, has just done, what we are doing in Connecticut, and where we need to do more and what we're working on now, and I hope you can get involved. So these chemicals, as Eric said, are extraordinarily toxic, and study after study after study has shown that they are linked to kidney and testicular cancer, to reproductive disorders, low birth weights, and size of babies when they're born. There's a lot of evidence that these chemicals are linked to liver damage, high cholesterol. More studies coming out recently that they are linked to liver cancer, thyroid disruption. We know they disrupt hormones in our bodies, and impaired immunity to vaccines, particularly in children, also impaired immune function for all of us, and even ulcerative colitis. So a whole host of extremely serious diseases are the direct result of exposure to these toxic chemicals. And that is what kind of evolved in West Virginia, as Eric pointed out. And again, there's been so much research over the last 20, 30 years that have documented over and over again these consistent health impacts, even with the newer versions of these PFAS chemicals. So you may have heard just on Wednesday, April 10th, the EPA did take some really historic action, and this is really important. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. It was the first time ever that our federal government set a drinking water standard for certain PFAS chemicals. Prior to this, we have never had a requirement to test for PFAS in our drinking water. So we'll go into a little bit more about that in a second. Happy to answer any questions.
It's not cool to say nice things about big government, but this is kind of exactly what it's made for, right? I mean, that and bailing out banks, but that's not the point. Look, personally, I'm not worried about forever chemicals because my Brita filter's still been going strong after 9 years. But it's still a good idea to cut them out, even if it costs money. Now, people have called me a big spender, but I am willing to pay a little more for water that doesn't make everyone I love throw up and die. And it's the same reason I buy name brand Cheerios and not the Asbestios on the bottom shelf. Now, it'd be one thing if forever chemicals tasted good, like if they had that same flavor as the cucumber water sitting in the lobby of that Hampton Inn for who knows how long. You know, then I'd be like, yeah, it's worth getting the cancer. But since there's no flavor, I mean, this is a no-brainer, okay? Water is supposed to be healthy. That's why your one weird coworker has that giant bottle, because she wants to...
So a little humor, because this is a very difficult subject for people to hear and take in. And every time I know Eric and I talk about this, we see eyes glaze over and people kind of shut down, because it is very scary. And, you know, when we go into our stores and purchase items, consumer products and things like that, we assume that they are safe and they've been tested by our government to make sure that they are not harmful. But that is absolutely the wrong assumption. There's no laws in this country that requires the testing of products that contain toxic chemicals that are in commerce, that are in consumer products, to be determined to be safe before they're put into use. So we are now, unfortunately, bearing the brunt of at least this class of very toxic chemicals. But as I said, we have some good news. For the first time ever, just this week, our federal government did propose national primary drinking water standards for this group of PFAS chemicals right here that we're seeing. So as Eric said, there's 15,000 of these chemicals. We're talking about 6 that are going to be regulated by the federal government. But it's a start. These are the most commonly known and commonly tested, but it's 6 out of 15,000. So the good point here is that the EPA really ratcheted down the health goals for PFAS in drinking water. As Eric said before, we didn't have a standard that was legally required, but we did have health guidelines. And for example, Connecticut had a health guideline of 70 parts per trillion for the sum of 5 PFAS chemicals. And that was not a legal requirement, but it was a suggested requirement for our water utility systems. Now this will be a legal requirement by our federal government that all drinking water sources will have to meet these standards. So you can see how low they've gone. For PFOA, 4 parts per trillion. For PFOS, 4 parts per trillion. And for these, the EPA has done a very unique thing in that they have determined that for the combination of all of these variations of PFAS, they're going to rely on a hazard index, which means that instead of just, because they're so toxic, instead of saying 4 parts per trillion, they are going to look at, as the research comes out, what is the most smallest level that poses any hazard. So this is huge. This is the first time EPA has ever done that. It is a good thing. There's more work to be done, but you can tell how far down, based on the research, when we talked about just a year ago, we had 70 parts per trillion for the sum of 5. Now we're talking about 4 parts per trillion for 1. So that just gives you a sense of how toxic, how harmful these chemicals are. So this was a really good move by the government. In Connecticut, you know, many of us knew that the EPA was working on this, and we've been in constant contact with our Department of Public Health, the agency that regulates our drinking water, and we knew that this perhaps was going to be adopted into law. And we know that the Department of Public Health has worked with the water utility systems in our state, and everyone is prepared to get down to this level. But this is still a work in progress. It's going to take some time for water utilities to get there, drinking water sources to get there. And as Eric pointed out, even though we can filter out these chemicals, what do we do with the filters? In Connecticut, where does our trash go? We send it out of state. It goes to a landfill in Pennsylvania, Ohio. Some of it is incinerated, so we are not destroying these chemicals. We are just putting them back into the environment. So we do have a long way to go, and unfortunately, as Eric rightfully said, the research is not there yet, the technology is not there yet to effectively destroy these chemicals. But this is good progress. It's very good for our health. This is going to save millions of lives. So you know, the maximum contaminant level guideline, that's the goal. That's not a legally enforceable standard. So what they're saying is the goal for PFAS is 0. But what's going to be legally enforceable, what we can measure, we can't even measure 0. We can't even, we don't even have the ability to do that. So 4 parts per trillion and then 1 for a hazard index is the standard for these PFAS in drinking water. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is very good news. And I just mentioned to Eric that Senator Blumenthal has been a real champion on this issue, and has brought a lot of money to the state to help our agencies work on this, is doing a press event on Monday to talk about this new rule being adopted. So good news on that front. But what else is happening? It's good that we can adopt a drinking water standard, and that's huge progress. But Connecticut has been a leader nationally in addressing PFAS, and I'm really proud of that. We worked hard with a number of people. Eric, right in this room, has been instrumental in helping us. Representative Garibay, many others have helped us pass. Susan helped us pass these laws. So as Eric said, the governor, Governor Lamont, did really take swift action to identify this task force of all the agencies and commissioners. And the PFAS action plan is online. You can Google it. It is very comprehensive. I have to say it is thorough. It is well done. And what we have to do now is just make sure that all of those components of the plan are actually being implemented. It is a plan, it was recommendations to the governor, it was not a law. So we have to make sure, and this is kind of where, our role, my role comes in, to make sure that we're monitoring that and, how quickly are you implementing that plan? So we're on that. We just established standards for the drinking water. We want to establish standards for discharge, for limits for PFAS in air and water, so air emissions out of an incinerator. And we want to evaluate the levels of PFAS that reach wastewater treatment plants, biosolids, and compost, because all of those are other sources of contamination that could be impacting our health and our environment. So again, monitoring all of the areas of concern throughout the state. And we know that when we test all of these areas, we're going to find PFAS. We know that. So we have to go out, test, monitor, and then as best as possible, clean up to the best of our ability. That link is the site for additional information if you want to look it up. There is a lot online, which is helpful, but the state is moving in the right direction to try to address this. You may have heard that our Attorney General Tong, back in April, also took some very significant action, like many other attorneys general across the country. But I have to say he's been a lead on this. He has organized other attorneys general to come together and really push for strong actions against the manufacturers of these chemicals to hold them accountable. There's a huge concern that DuPont and 3M are entering into settlements and giving, a few $1 million to states for cleanup or biomonitoring, which means testing individuals. But his point, and many other attorneys general feel that that is not enough. We need to keep them on the hook, and we're going to need a lot more funds to come from the people that cause this pollution. So in March of this year, he announced a very significant lawsuit against 28 manufacturers, including DuPont and 3M, for billions of dollars in funds that will come to Connecticut. So all of that is good. I share that because that was a really important step to hold polluters accountable and to not have all of the burden of this fall on all of us.
May I add something there?
Please, please.
The financial scale of this is on par with the damage that was done by smoking and the opioid crisis.
Absolutely.
This is massive in terms of the damage
Yeah.
and cost recovery that's needed.
And it will be for years, decades. We have, so we work, just as an aside, we work with a national coalition, and we have colleagues up in Alaska who have biomonitored indigenous tribes who live in the remotest part of Alaska, and they have extraordinarily high levels of PFAS in their blood. Why? Because they eat the fish and the mammals and the whales, as Eric said, that have, taken up these PFAS chemicals, and that's what they live off of. So The Arctic is a sink for toxic chemicals, and the biomonitoring studies that have come out from those folks is just heartbreaking. So this is a map that you can also get online. It's by the Environmental Working Group. You may be familiar with them. They do a lot of really great work. They are a nonprofit like we are, and they have done an interactive map documenting the PFAS contamination crisis across the 50 states. And this is probably very conservative, but you can see it's all around the industrial areas where all of the facilities, the DuPonts, the 3Ms, all of the industrial facilities along the Eastern Corridor, and then out in California, et cetera, all in the Midwest where 3M is located, headquartered, huge amounts of contamination. Because again, these chemicals get into the environment, into our soil, into the groundwater, and then they move. So they're huge plumes. So you may read about the plumes in the Midwest and the Great Lakes. It's really very devastating. But this is an ongoing interactive map that, again, it's Environmental Working Group. You can go online and find it. One of the things that Eric and I have been pushing a lot, even our agencies have done a really good job, and we want to acknowledge that, and we appreciate their expertise. But we have been pushing them for more transparency in their testing in Connecticut. And, obviously we understand that they don't want to alarm the public unnecessarily, but the public's already alarmed. And people want to know, if there's PFAS in their environment, in their groundwater, in their wells, things like that. So this is an issue that we'll continue to work on. We talked to DEEP. I just had a meeting with them last week and talked about this. They know about it. They do have a plan for monitoring. They've identified over 2,400 sites that are the high-risk sites, and then they'll go out and monitor and test in a strategic, exponential manner. But we want more public transparency about that. And lastly, I want to tell you about one of the top things that I'm really excited about, proud of, hopeful for, is that we do have a bill in the Connecticut General Assembly this session to stop further contamination. And the thing that Eric and I always say is, it's great that we have to test, we have to find out where this contamination is, we have to remediate to the extent that we can, we have to put up fish bans and fish advisories, we have to, set drinking water standards, but we also have to stop polluting. It's like, hello, it's so crazy. So we do have a bill in the General Assembly. It's Senate Bill 292. It's an act concerning the use of PFAS in certain products. What this bill will do is it's pretty common sense. It's going to restrict the sale of consumer products that expose us and get into our environment. It's going to restrict the sale of carpets, textiles, apparel, dental floss, ski wax, menstrual products, children's products, cookware that contains PFAS chemicals. And it proposes to do that by 2026. All of those consumer products have alternatives already in the marketplace that don't contain PFAS. So it is not going to impact us economically or, from a personal choice perspective. We have to take these products out of the marketplace. The second thing it will do is by 2027, it's going to require all manufacturers of products to report to DEEP if they have any intentionally added PFAS. So what that will do is we'll find out what are the other products that we don't know about that are being sold or distributed in our state that may be additional sources of contamination. So that will be a really good way for us as members of the public to know what else is an area of concern that we might want to take action on. And so this bill passed out of the Environment Committee unanimously. Yay! And it is now on the Senate calendar, but we have 3 weeks to go. And we need to get it through the Senate, and then through the House, and then to the governor's desk, which we know he will sign it if it gets to his desk. So we have a lot of work to do to get this passed. And so what we're asking is, if you care about this, if this makes sense to you, let your representative and your senator know. As I said, it had bipartisan unanimous support. So the other thing, excuse me, is that what I mentioned earlier is that Eric and I continue to meet with DPH, and kind of say, okay, where are you at with the plan? Where are you at with the plan? And, you know, we have very good relationships with them, I have to say. They trust us, they know that we're credible, so we have good meetings with them. But I think it's really important that that becomes a little bit more transparent. It is a very good plan, very thorough plan. Many states don't have a plan. But we need to make sure that it's not something that's sitting on the shelf and gets forgotten about. So that is the next, these two steps are the things that are taking up most of our time right now. So that's it. The call to action that I urge you to consider, again, is Senate Bill 292. Talk to your state senators and representatives. Ask them to get it voted in the Senate. Representative Garibay.
I just told her. Yeah.
She's always been supportive.
Zoom in on Jane, Michael.
Yeah, zoom in. She's going to kill us. But you have others in the area that may not be as aware of it. So just bring it to their attention. We want to make sure that everybody, these legislators, Jane can tell you, they're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of bills. And so not everyone knows that this is out there and on the Senate calendar. So it's just making our legislators aware and urging them to support it. So we've got 3 weeks to go to get this passed. I'm counting on you. And thank you again for having me, and I'm going to turn it back to Eric for questions. And
First, thank you, Ann. Ann is incredibly modest. This is Ann Hewlett's lifeblood in the last 6 months to get this bill to where it is, and she deserves an amazing amount of credit.
we're a team. We're a team.
So questions, yeah, we'll ask the question and then we'll repeat it for the microphone. Who doesn't have a question? Look it up, Maureen.
My first question is for you. Where did the contamination come from in that story you had shared about the farmers in Maine? Did they have any idea what contaminated the soil?
The biosolids. So do you all know what biosolids are? Biosolids are a nice term for waste, human and animal waste that is treated and then spread on soil as a soil amendment. So it's been widely used and supported by EPA and our government for decades. And that was what we did, right? We put it on our farms, on our soil as fertilizer. And
They take what comes out of the sewage treatment plants.
Yes.
The sludge at the bottom of the tank
yeah,
gets trucked and spread on the fields.
yeah. And so that once
wanna stop
we
eating.
found, even though it's treated, as Eric pointed out, we can't treat those PFAS chemicals. So these farmers in Maine, and many of them their farms have been devastated. And they can't farm anymore. So it was the application of biosolids. Now, in Connecticut's DEEP does not permit the use of biosolids on our farms. But there may have been application of biosolids by, me if I want to farm my land, and so we don't know. So, but in Maine and in many other big agricultural states, that was the system. So it was spread all over. That's what's happened in the Midwest. So
if you're buying commercial compost, for instance, you'd like it to be labeled no biosolids.
yes,
Oh, good point.
yes, that's a really good point. So, unfortunately, we've learned over the years that these chemicals didn't get treated out of biosolids.
Susan Miller.
Thank you. I have two parts. One is, how likely is it that manufacturers will just switch to one of the other not 6 PFAS type chemicals and keep going? And then part 2 is, when Connecticut says PFAS, do they mean the class or do they mean individual chemicals?
So those are very good questions. So in Connecticut, we have a definition on the books, and this was a big deal, that PFAS means the class. And that was a big deal. The chemical industry does not like that. Yeah, so to your first question, yes, the chemical industry is constantly making new variations of these chemicals. And the new variations, they refer to them as short chain because they have maybe 1 or 2 of the fluorine carbon bonds, or 6 or 4, versus the older versions had more than that. The chemical industry will tell you that the shorter versions are safe. Or how they'll say it is, there's no evidence that the shorter versions, the new versions, are harmful. Well, that's a legally accurate statement, but there's no evidence of it because they're pumping out new variations before anybody has time to test and research. And they don't do the research themselves. The bit of research that is coming out more and more on the newer variations is showing the same health impacts. Some of the shorter chain, this may be a little too chemistry, but some of the shorter chain versions may not stay in our bodies as long, but they just go out into our environment and continue to build up. So you really can't say they're not as harmful.
Comes down to a fundamental difference between the way regulation is done here and in the European Union. Generally here, the term is generally recognized as safe. So it's assumed something is GRAS. In Europe, you have to demonstrate that it is safe. So that's why we're playing catch up in a bunch of these areas.
So a lot of these products you probably wouldn't be able to sell in Europe.
A lot of them, Europe is ahead of us in phasing out all PFAS. And they're ahead of us in most chemical policy reforms.
And there's some greenwashing and marketing. I saw this
Yes.
at Ocean State Job Lot, a frying pan. So we're
Yes.
calling PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. The label said no PFOA and no PFOS. Those are 2 types of PFAS. It just says they don't have those 2 in it, but we don't know that they don't have everything else. So as a consumer, you have to Be
Be
skeptical.
vigilant.
Yes.
Vigilant.
Yeah.
And if it's anti-stick, anti-stain, anti-wrinkle, permanent, any, my waterproof mascara.
My eyeliner?
Yeah. That probably has PFAS. Yeah.
So sorry, am I the only one that has questions?
No.
I have two questions. What's your recommendation to filter your water at home? I mean, I don't have a Brita, I have a zero water. I think that,
Yeah, so there are filters that you can buy. I honestly don't know about Brita. I don't know if I don't
Not so
think
much.
they filter out PFAS.
I have to do my
Parts
research
per
on zero
trillion,
water.
it's really small.
That's
They're just
the
small.
issue, that's the
Yeah.
issue. There are water filters, if you go online, and EWG, Environmental Working Group, has a whole
Well, that's why I
list.
switched to zero water, because they gave the
Okay,
zero water
good,
a higher
okay.
grade than the Brita.
Yeah.
Because I have done a lot of research on the EWG website.
Oh, good, okay. So they're reliable. We use them, they're a trusted source. There are systems, you can get under sink systems, you can get whole house reverse osmosis systems. That's what our water utilities might use. So you can use reverse osmosis, granulated, activated charcoal. Yeah.
Yes.
There are ways to filter it out. It's just then what do you do with the filters? But at least there are systems in place. Many are more expensive than others, but there are systems. If you Google or go on EWG, you can find them.
One challenge is the public water supplies are going to be required to test and to get to this 4 parts per trillion level. There are 300,000 private drinking wells in just Connecticut.
Yeah.
These regulations aren't applying there.
That was my question, because when I posted the flyer for this on the Windsor Facebook page, one of the people asked about testing of wells. And that's what I was going to ask, because there were town councilors here, but it looks like they
We
left.
still have two.
Oh, just- So, no, there's one. It was just always- So, yeah. So that was the question, is the town going to do anything for the people, particularly along the, Connecticut River? The Farmington River and stuff, because that just was a question that somebody
Yeah.
asked on that posting.
Yeah,
But
it's
they didn't come
up to
here
the
to ask the
town.
question, too bad.
The state does not have a law that requires the state to test private wells. Personally, I think that may be something that we want to think about in the future. How would we do that? There are some places like on Martha's Vineyard where they have a ton of contamination where they're just giving out filters to everybody. Excuse me. So there's things that can be done. It's costly.
Yeah, well, I noticed that, when I was thinking of the question, and it was on the slide, you talked about lack of testing.
Yes. Yep.
Here, so.
Yep.
yeah.
The wells, private wells is a big deal in
Yeah.
Connecticut.
Yeah. Susan?
On the testing front, has that process gotten better, quicker? Are there more places that are testing now?
There are certainly more places now, and you can buy kits for home
Yeah.
that you don't need a whole lot of special training. But you do have to be careful given the small quantities, because you don't want to go testing wearing your Scotch-guarded jacket
Yeah.
and then go collect a water sample. Just having gloves that have touched your jacket and then touched the sample just contaminated your sample. So there's a level of discipline and
That's
care
so
that needs
true.
to be taken, which is why it's been hard to test.
Hard, yeah,
But this is an emerging business,
it really is.
which will also bring, sadly with it, shady operators, I fear.
Sorry,
Yeah.
one more.
Oh, yeah.
I love that Connecticut is the first, and I hope it spreads to other states, because historically, we get wind and air and contaminants from Massachusetts and New York. So hopefully somehow they will pick up on that. Is there any headway into
Yeah.
that?
So New York is working on a law right now, or a bill. Massachusetts is as well, Rhode Island is as well, New Hampshire is, Maine has passed a very strong law. So a lot of states across the country, and including the Northeast, are taking action.
We
Yeah.
were quite far ahead when the first action plan came out. We haven't kept up the same pace
That's right.
as we did initially. So other surrounding states have gotten ahead of where Connecticut is in terms of testing and regulation.
Yeah.
Ori?
I had another question. So I believe it was you, Eric, that mentioned that because of the action plan, companies like McDonald's, they can't sell you a hamburger that's lined in PFAS, the wrappers. Whose job is it to make sure that that's happening?
That's part of what
And-
this Senate bill
And
is. It puts the onus on the companies to test and then certify that their products don't contain PFAS, and they have to register any product that has intentionally added PFAS.
Yeah.
So the companies have to then go to their suppliers and work back up the supply chain.
That's right. You know, until that, we have a Department of Consumer Protection that can go out and test certain products, spot test, and they do, but we do not have the resources in our agencies to do that to the degree that's needed. But one of the legislators, Representative Palm, said in one meeting that we were at, but you know, we have stop signs. We put stop signs up and assume that people are going to follow the rules and obey the law, and for the most part, people do. So the thinking is that at least if we pass a law, which we did, to ban PFAS in food packaging, hopefully large companies will follow along. So,
Jamie, did you have a question? I saw your hand earlier.
No, just, you used to call biomass vermiculite, but I think it's called malorganite now. I think they've relabeled it when you see that in your fertilizer.
Oh, vermiculite is
Not vermiculite.
something different.
Not
Okay.
vermiculite, hermiculite. Used to be
Hermiculite.
trade name. Now
Okay.
now it's called malorganite.
Okay.
So it doesn't say biomass, it never will say that. We used to ship all that stuff to New York where they would process it. and send it.
Gotcha.
yeah.
So one last question, and then we'll wrap up here.
I got another one. Oh, no, you haven't asked.
I have two questions. So you talked a lot about how it stays in our body. Is there any science on how the body filters out these chemicals and how long it takes, if at all?
It's hard to know because we're not biomonitoring ourselves.
Okay.
We're not getting our blood drawn and testing how much is in our bodies and when it leaves and when it doesn't. There are some studies that show if you really reduce your exposure, then you do your kidneys and liver will filter it out. But we are constantly re-exposing ourselves. So it's really hard to know.
And my second question isn't completely related to that. Is there any way to monitor or know what products are in the market now that do have PFAS in them? So obviously there is what there is now. Do we know if people, not so much what products have it, but creating new PFAS in new chemical bonds and introducing it out? Do we have any way of monitoring that, or is that part of that new bill of kind of?
Well, unfortunately, as Eric said, in our country, industry is just allowed to produce new chemical variations and put them in products, and we have no way of knowing.
Okay.
So we really don't. These chemicals are used in not only consumer products, which is a high source of exposure and environmental contamination. They are used in industrial processes, lubricants, medical devices, they're in stents, they're in pacemakers, they're in
Fracking
yeah.
fluids.
yeah, car washes that,
Can I say one more question? I had done a research project with one of my graduate students years ago. It was about the cosmetic industry. And a lot of the toxins that people expose themselves to, willingly, unwillingly, in the cosmetic industry, they found that they would deposit in the fat cells.
yeah.
And I was just wondering, is there a similar correlation, do you believe, with the PFAS?
Yes, these have hormone disrupting properties. So, yeah, they do accumulate in fat cells, and they are now found in breast milk, in the placenta, in umbilical cord blood. They're
Because our
everywhere.
research project was about breast cancer, because
Yeah.
I used to work at the cancer center, and we were noticing a pretty substantially
Yes.
large number of younger women
Yeah.
that were coming in with breast cancer.
Yeah, a lot of the chemicals in cosmetics are other kinds of endocrine disruptors. So endocrine is our hormone system. And so many of these chemicals mimic estrogen. And so if you have more estrogen in your body, particularly women at certain ages, and men too, actually, I shouldn't just say women, but there's been strong links to breast cancer because our body doesn't recognize that this is a synthetic estrogen versus a naturally occurring estrogen. It's a huge
Another
problem.
good reason to get thin.
No, you don't lose your fat cells. They just get smaller. Once you've got them, you don't lose them.
Well,
So I'm just screwed.
I think it would be
I'm not planning on
in the
living
cell
forever
wall, the
anyway.
lipid,
So,
that lipid.
Thank you all very
layer
much.
of
We'll
cells.
wrap up the video. TV has recorded it, so we'll make it available and we'll post the presentation and a collection of links.
Is it going to be on the Windsor site also? The Windsor, like YouTube?
Yes, it should be.
Win TV.
Yeah.
Win
It's
TV.
gonna be a
Win
Win
TV.
TV, and then it'll be
Yeah.
an ours.
Not the town of Windsor. Yes.
For the goodness.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Win TV channel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, thank you.